Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Jason Toney, and I work for Black Rose Books. Welcome to Transformative Planning, Radical Alternatives to Neoliberal Urbanism, a live stream event with Tom Angotti, Annette Koh, Silky Shah, and Edwin R. Quiles-Rodriguez. Thanks a lot to our partners, the Planners Network and Progressive Cities Magazine. This talk is centered around the book Transformative Planning. Given that this talk will explore the themes of the book very thoroughly, I won't tell you too much about it. I'm sure you'll want to buy it after the event, as it will be plenty of compelling things will be said. So if you want to buy this book after the event, you can visit our website at www.blackrosebooks.com for a physical copy, or you can visit our ebook shop at payhip.com/blackrosebooks. There's links to this book and all the others in the description below this event. And I'm going to tell you about some other relevant titles before we move on to the content of the event. So I'm going to use the power of technology here and show you my screen and tell you about some books. So first, The Rise of Cities. The Rise of Cities has a thorough introduction which explores the history and contemporary context of urbanism from a global perspective. The book focuses on Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and multiple cities in Spain. In light of the unprecedented rate of urbanization around the world, The Rise of Cities demonstrates why the state has failed and must fail to end the urban crisis, and it examines the path forward. The next book I'm going to tell you about is Villages and Cities: Community Land Ownership, Cooperative Housing, and the Milton Park Story. This book tells the story of the Milton Park neighborhood in Montreal, the largest nonprofit cooperative housing project in North America. Milton Park is an example of an urban struggle that took decades to unfold. It began in 1968 with a tremendous amount of planning and participation by architects, organizers, and ordinary people who fought to save their housing and their neighborhood, and ultimately established 22 housing associations on a land trust in the heart of the city. The book also covers many other land trusts in North America. And lastly, I'm going to tell you about free public transit and why we don't pay to ride elevators. This book argues convincingly and with documentation for the future and feasibility of free public transit, and it documents the political and economic effects it would have. The contributors examine the implementation of free public transit and the emergence of advocacy for it across 5 continents. And lastly, I'm just going to go ahead and show you our ebook shop. So this is where you can donate. And this is the ebook shop, payhip.com/blackrosebooks. We have a number of books. Pretty much all of them are discounted about 50%. The books I just mentioned are all $5 right now. Several books are only $1, and then the rest are usually about $7. We're grateful for any amount you can contribute. You are able to pay more if you want to, and we're really excited about the reception we've gotten to this ebook shop, and we definitely encourage you to go ahead and check it out. So with that, I turn back on my video. Voila. So this live stream series, this is our 4th event, and we're going to have another event on June 4th at 8 p.m. And we'll be live streaming a discussion with Eve Engler, Andrea Levy, and Tamara Lawrence on why Canada doesn't deserve a seat on the UN Security Council. This talk is in relation to Eve Engler's latest book, House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. We'd encourage you to go ahead and register for that event. You can do so in the description of this video. And we'll be having a larger series that will extend through the summer and into the fall that we're already starting to put together. So stay tuned for updates. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking the subscribe button right under this video, so you can stay up to date, or you can like us on any social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. If you want to ask any questions during this event, you can write them in the chat right next to this video in the sidebar. And if you have any trouble with that, you can go ahead and email your questions to nathan@blackrosebooks.com. We tend to have a period at the end of the event to answer questions that come in from the audience. And the last technical thing I want to add is if you have any technical issues with the buffering or anything like that with your video, you can click the settings wheel in the bottom right-hand corner of this video and go ahead and lower the quality, and that should help resolve any issue you're having. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about our speakers before I hand off the event to Tom. So first, I'll start with Tom. Tom Angotti is a professor emeritus of urban policy and planning at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. He was the founder and director of Hunter College Center for Community Planning and Development. His recent books include Zoned Out, Race, Displacement, and City Planning in New York City, Urban Latin America, Inequalities and Neoliberal Reforms, The New Century of the Metropolis, New York for Sale, Inequalities and Neoliberal Reforms, and Community Planning Confronts Global Real Estate, which won the Davidoff Book Award. And lastly, Accidental Warriors and Battlefield Myths. He's the editor of ProgressiveCity.net and participating editor for Latin American Perspectives and Local Environments. He is active in community and environmental issues in New York City. Next, Silky Shah is the executive director of Detention Watch Network, a national coalition building power to abolish immigration detention in the US. She has worked as an organizer on issues related to immigration detention, mass incarceration, and racial and migrant justice for over 15 years. She is the author of the article Immigration Policy and Planning in the Era of Mass Incarceration, which is part of the Transformative Planning collection. Annette Koh teaches urban planning at Cal Poly Pomona. She co-organized the first and second Decolonizing Cities Symposia at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and is continuing to learn about how to decolonize urban planning. She authored the articles Decolonial Planning in North America and Placemaking When Black Lives Matter. She is also a member of the editorial board of Progressive City. Edwin R. Quiles-Rodriguez is a community architect and planner, and he's the founder and former director of the University of Puerto Rico Community Design Workshop. His design projects have been presented widely, and he authored the essay Resistance and Planning, Puerto Rico and Beyond, which is also in the collection. So with that, I want to thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to hand over the event to Tom, who's going to moderate this discussion and give an introduction. Hope you enjoy.
Thank you, Jason. Can you hear me? My sound okay?
Indeed.
Yes, okay.
Yep.
Well, it's wonderful to be here with this, with authors of the book. I'm going to just do a quick explanation of what the book is about. It's called Transformative Planning, Radical Alternatives to Neoliberal Urbanism. So let's start with some definitions. Planning. What is planning? Well, the planning profession, planning as an activity, begins with industrial capitalism in Europe in the 19th century. Why? Because cities were being built for industrial capital, and they were chaotic, filled with spontaneous housing that didn't have adequate services. Pandemics attacked, and so folks in charge, the royalty, looked to professionals. And the first urban planning experiment occurs in Paris when the king hires an engineer to figure out how to make some rational sense out of this chaotic city. And by the way, this came after the working class sponsored a revolution that took control of Paris. So the king was very concerned that the working class will not get organized. So they hired a planner to build a giant city, a giant highway going into the city that wiped out the working class neighborhoods that were the source of the revolution to begin with. And so the planning profession comes from architecture and engineering, and tries to make some rational sense out of the chaos that industrial capitalism brings to city building. And planners were, for the next century and a half, almost entirely white, male, and European. What is transformative planning is defined defined by another series of political and social transformations that occur in the 20th century. And these are the roots of transformative planning. In the United States, we trace it to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, which is a continuation of the long struggle for freedom and liberation for enslaved peoples in the United States. So something started in the 1960s with the struggles of Black communities against displacement by the Federal Urban Renewal Program and the Federal Highway Program that were destroying their neighborhoods. And this gave birth to what was called advocacy planning. So there were professional planners who stepped up and said, well, wait a minute, we were trained to work for the king, but we want to work with the civil rights movement. And that's what advocacy planning was all about. And Planners for Equal Opportunity was the organization that brought together a multiracial group of urbanists, planners, architects, designers, who were in solidarity with the communities of color that were fighting against displacement. This gave then rise to some other trends, what was called equity planning. There were people working in government who said, well, we can work with inside government in alliance with the social movements, the urban movements, the civil rights movement, to build and create and sustain just cities. That was called equity planning. Then it was progressive planning. Planners Network started in 1975 as an expression of this very broad network of professionals and activists that came together because of their concern about building and sustaining just cities. And so when we talk about radical alternatives, the radical alternatives come from the grassroots, the communities, the activists, and the professionals who are working with them inside and outside government, and mostly outside. Progressive Planning magazine, which I co-edited, and Progressive City Online, which I now also co-edit with others, are expressions of this. And if you look through the many articles we've had over the decades, including the ones of people who are on this discussion, and others who are in the book, it's a real diverse population, including people who are considered and consider themselves professional planners, but many others who are activists who are dealing with planning issues. So you don't have to be a professional to deal with planning. All you have to do is live in a city and be concerned with the way your neighborhood, your city looks and develops and feels, and the injustices, and what works and what doesn't work, and what's just and unjust in the city. So my own understanding of the key questions, and you'll see them in this wide array of articles, is who plans, who benefits, and what's in the plan. So planning is both substance and process. So it's not just participation. We have a whole planning trend called participatory planning, which is not necessarily democratic and not even necessarily fully participatory. So the question is not only who participates, but who makes the decisions and what are the consequences and who benefits and who pays as a result of those consequences. So planning is both substance and process. Now, what is neoliberal urbanism? Well, this comes into being in the 1970s and 80s with the fiscal crisis and the birth of neoliberalism as a means of undermining a strong state and state intervention in urban development. And it's dominated until the present day. Our national policies, our local policies are all driven by one thing: getting private capital to come into the city and solve all our problems. So you have a housing problem? Well, you get developers to come in and invest. Oh, well, they're not building affordable housing? Oh, well, then you give them concessions and tax breaks and whatever in order that they build you a little bit of affordable housing, which usually isn't affordable. So that's neoliberal urbanism, and it's still a nut that we're trying to crack. We don't need primarily capital to solve the problems of inequality and injustice, mass incarceration, discrimination, displacement en masse of communities of color. We don't need private capital to do that. It would help to have government capital, but neoliberalism says government can't do anything. As Ronald Reagan said, government's the problem, not the solution. And so at every turn, we're now confronting neoliberalism within the mainstream professions. One of the classical answers that the neoliberals have is public-private partnerships. So you can't have the public do anything by itself. You need to have a private partner. And what do private partners want to do? They want to make money and they want to build. So you need a developer. Somebody's got to make a profit out of it. But why do you have to make a profit out of providing decent housing for people who are living on the street because they can't afford housing? And so the market rules and government obeys. That's neoliberal urbanism, and that's why we need radical alternatives. And so the alternatives are born in the struggles of resistance for land, for housing, for a better quality of life. And they lead to social policies. Now, I mentioned the civil rights movement and the grassroots community-based movements, but there are many other movements that have contributed to planning. The women's movement. Thankfully, that population of all white male Europeans who were dominating planning is no longer so obvious. And the profession itself has transformed. And it's more gender diverse, even if it's not more racially diverse. So the percentage of African-American planners today is not significantly higher than it was 50 years ago. And I guess I want to end by saying that despite the tremendous criticisms that we have of traditional planning and the problems that planning has caused people in their daily lives, we need planning today more than ever. And this is the contradiction. And I write about it too in one of the chapters. Because of climate change, we are confronting metropolitan areas around the country that are dominated by private capital, private transportation, the automobile, and the planet is heating up. We've been separated from our food production. We get food from factory farms that are based on industrial production of food that's not healthy and is making us sick and fat. So we need it, and our coastal cities, and most of our cities, our biggest cities, are located on coasts, are facing a catastrophic sea level rise. So what do? The neoliberal solution is, well, get capital to invest in moving the cities upland. Well, for who? Already we see it's disaster capitalism. The alternatives are providing capital for those who already have it and who can build their homes upland, who can spend the money to raise the level of their foundations. But that's not the majority of working people. And it's definitely not the majority of people of color who have been excluded from living in the safe places. So it's a matter of climate justice. And we also have this really increasing problem of the urban-rural divide, the way we've separated our cities from the places where food is grown and where we need to grow things that will make the planet safer, and not just use them as recreational areas for vacations. And that's where we also begin to talk about, and I know Annette is going to say something about this too. She writes about it, the colonial legacies in the United States, in the Americas, the US and Canada, that have led us to treat land and other people and other species the way we do. And so transformative planning is a search for an answer to all of these problems. And part of it is finding a different way, a different process of planning, but also it's a way to search for different solutions in building and maintaining cities as just cities and maintaining the right to the city. Our utopias are very important. Our dreams about a better life in cities are very important. And it's not just the planners who dream. In fact, planners don't dream enough. Actually, I will end also with a plug for a couple of other white guys. Murray Bookchin and Paul and Percival Goodman have both written as challenges to professional urban planning visions with utopian ideas, ideas about building a better city. And what we have to do is create an environment in which everybody contributes to the utopia. And everybody has a say in determining the shape of the future of our cities. And so it's a broad-ranging discussion, and it's not just for the professionals. It's not just for the academics. It's for all of the activists who are working for a better life. And with that, let's go to our three other participants. Let me turn it over to Edwin Quiles. And I have two questions for Edwin. But first, I want to show folks, if you read Spanish, this is a fantastic book. El haitiano que hablaba inglés. Edwin wrote this about the experiences he had working with grassroots groups in Haiti to rebuild after the earthquake. And I would say that's a good example of transformative planning. So Edwin, in your contribution to the book, you talk about resistance. What role does resistance play in planning? And can you give some examples from Puerto Rico? And the second question is, you're an architect and a planner. How can architects and planners be involved in planning and creating new and more just cities? Is Edwin there?
It looks like he's still muted.
Moderators, do we have a connection with Edwin?
Hold on, everybody. I see Edwin is still here, but he doesn't have his mic on. We might have to go out of order, Tom.
Yes, I'm thinking that. I can't even find my my chat.
I have the questions for both me and Silky, if you need a.
Yeah, no, I've got them.
Okay.
I just sent a note to Edwin. And if there's no response in just a bit, then we'll go on to Silky. Okay, so the questions I have for Silky is, tell us how immigration policy and border militarization affects the carceral society, as you discuss in your article. And also, how has it gotten worse under Trump?
Small questions. No, it's you know, it's interesting. I think when I wrote this article, and I was, you know, I'm not in the planning world, and I don't, I'm an activist, an organizer, lead this national network. But as you were talking, Tom, I feel like actually in so many ways, there's so much connection to the relationship between what's happening with the growth of jails specifically and prisons in the US, and the planning around that, and the, you know, the massive increase of detention that we've seen, not just under Trump, but prior to Trump. And so when I think about the, you know, the relationship between immigration and border militarization and incarceration, I mean, I think in so many ways over the years, there's actually this great book that came out recently called Migrating to Prison by a professor out of Denver who really looked who does this crimmigration blog called, his name is Cesar, that really looks at the ways that there has been incarceration over the years of immigrants, but in reality, you know, in truth, the sort of system we're negotiating right now is so much a system that sort of follows the trajectory, that sort of follows the growth of mass incarceration we've seen over the last 40 years in the US. And so for a long time, actually, immigrants weren't detained for their immigration status. And I think for people to understand, people who are in detention currently who are immigrants are there for a civil violation. And then there's also a set of folks who are criminalized for their immigration status who are in Bureau of Prisons custody. And so you have, which wasn't actually happening for a long time. And so in the 80s, what you saw was a real growth of both the prison system in the US and then also harsher immigration laws over the years. And then the response to those harsh immigration laws was, well, let's grow the detention system. And so there was a lot of different laws that passed over the years, but basically, you know, by the time we get to Trump, we're at about 55,000. The highest point for the Trump administration over the last couple of years was 55,000 people at any given time in immigration detention. And over the course of a year, probably about 400,000 people going through the system. And the way that that happens is that the US, like the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the US agency that detains immigrants actually subcontracts out all of those contracts, except for 5. So there's over 200 facilities, except for 5 to county jails and private prison companies, county and state facilities and private prison companies. So there's an inherent incentive when you have a facility in a rural community, in a county jail in a rural community. A lot of times a sheriff will be like, well, these ICE contracts are very lucrative for us. And so we're going to go into business with ICE to detain people because we're going to, you know, you'll have a sheriff say, I get $60 a day from ICE to detain somebody, but I'm only going to spend $12 a day on this person. So I'm pocketing the rest of it for the county because we're a struggling county trying to pad our budget. You also have the private prisons, which for the context of ICE, where again, they only have 5 of their own facilities. And a lot of those services are contracted out like guards and food, et cetera. You have a situation where ICE is like, well, actually the private prison companies are going to do what we want them to do. So you have like, you know, that the desire to make quote unquote nicer facilities when Obama was really pushing for that. The Geo Group, which is one of the larger private prison companies, came out and said, okay, well, we'll create this really nice facility for you for low security individuals. And then when family detention came back, where they detain mothers and their children or fathers and their children together, they were like, oh, this nice facility that Geo made, we can use that. So in so many ways, there is a very clear relationship between how we choose to deal with the issue of immigration and, you know, the role of mass incarceration in the US, of incarceration, hyper incarceration, et cetera, and the use of incarceration. So both in the context of this sort of obsession that the US has with punishment and risk. So these individuals are, you know, like we need to make sure they go through their proceeding. We need to make sure that they comply with immigration law. So we're going to put them in these facilities, and we're fearful potentially of some people because they're past criminal convictions or because they haven't been vetted or et cetera. And then there's also this relationship between the counties and the states and entities and private companies that benefit from those federal dollars to incarcerate. So there is a strong correlation between, you know, how we think about planning for sure, and counties that have become dependent on prisons, the jobs, the money coming in, all the different services around it, for how they exist. And so that's, there's a lot more to be said there, but I'll leave it there. And then just on the Trump piece, I mean, I think it's, it's just like an understatement to say that things have gotten so incredibly worse under Trump. I mean, I think a lot of folks like myself, and if you read the article that I wrote, actually, it's very much about the Obama administration and sort of, what the Obama administration did in so many ways, took this system that had expanded over the years because of laws passed by Clinton and sort of post 9/11 stuff. And Obama took it and said, okay, let's make it a more humane system and let's give it some of that like structure and planning that we're talking, like in some ways, like Bush era was absolute chaos. We had no idea where people were detained. And then Obama came in and said, okay, because of a lot of push from advocates, we're gonna, create this thing called the online detainee locator system. We're gonna consolidate facilities. We're gonna bring the standards up, and we're gonna have a system that is more accountable. It's none of the standards are codified, so it's not accountable, but some transparency around it. But detention didn't go down. We know that under Obama, more people were deported, and a lot of people were detained. And then under Trump, he just, stripped a lot of those standards that Obama tried to make better, but then also just expanded. And one of the things we're negotiating right now is that you have all these other reforms happening, like in Louisiana and elsewhere, where there's criminal justice reform happening or justice reinvestment, and you have all these empty beds. And now Trump is like, I'm going to take those beds, and so immigration detention has just skyrocketed. And you also have family separation. So, I mean, in so many ways, and you have everything they're doing to block people from coming in. So the Remain in Mexico program, the asylum bans at the border, on top of increased enforcement and, the height of detention. Obviously, right now during COVID, we're like really pushing for calling everyone to be released, because detention in prisons are such major sites of, disease spreading, and also because people should just not be in there in the first place. But I think the numbers have gone down because there isn't as much, they've deported a lot of people, but not as many people are getting in and other stuff. So I think there's some questions right now about, well, what does that look like after this? And how can we really push to say, okay, these numbers have gone down. Can we make sure it stays that way, and gets better? So.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Silky. Now, Edwin, do we have you? And I just quickly remind folks about the two questions I asked. One was about resistance planning. What is that? And secondly, how can architects and planners be involved in creating more just cities? Edwin, are you still there?
He might be connecting now. Edwin?
Are you with us, Edwin?
Oh no.
1, 2, 3. Well, we can move on to Annette, and come back to Edwin. Hopefully, he'll be there. So Annette is the two questions I have for you are: explain what you mean by colonial planning and decolonial planning. And the second one is, what is placemaking, and how does it relate to Black Lives Matters? Because those are the two articles that you have in the collection. One is on colonial planning and the other one on placemaking and Black Lives Matters.
Yes, I am going to share my screen, hopefully successfully. So I'm going to take them out of order and start with placemaking and Black Lives Matter. If you spend too much time on the internet like me, you might have seen some tweets or social media kind of chatter about, this week, I think he's even like the Audubon Society, right? Like he's a bona fide birder, asked a woman in Central Park to leash her dog, and she called 911 and said that he was assaulting her, right? And so I think I wanted to just start with that because it's an individual act of racism that relies on structural racism, right? That she could call 911 and expect that they would back her up, that they would take, a Black man as automatically dangerous. So this idea of place and public space has really become, I think, highlighted in the current moment, right? People are talking about open streets, like closed to car traffic, like the need to have more sidewalk cafes, and all these kind of measures to create more space to more safely do social distancing. But I think, what's been very clear is that we've never had equitable access to public space, that Black and brown bodies have been criminalized, whether it's through stop and frisk in New York City, or, ICE, picking up people under suspicion of them not being documented. So when we say, oh, we're going to open up public spaces for everyone to use, it really requires, I think, a hard look at how structures of white supremacy have limited access to spaces, right? Like who gets to belong and who is seen as out of place. And so I think that's the piece where I want to stay hopeful, and I am sometimes still hopeful, that when we talk about placemaking as a process of collectively creating belonging, right? Like collectively, and it can be the small like pocket parks that you create with your neighbors, or it could be a monthly festival that you do in downtown. Whatever the kind of spatial mechanism and whatever the kind of timeline, the idea is that you're collectively claiming space and collectively deciding what you need from that space. But I really do want planners and also people who are urbanists or just people who care about the places they live, which is basically everybody, to not just go into the, oh, this is going to be so cool, we're going to close down the street, but think about sort of what are the implications, right? I think Tom's early question, who plans and who benefits? And I think, I'll actually go to this slide. My slides are just places or things that I've been learning. So I've been trying to understand how abolitionist planning would work as well as decolonial planning. And Survived and Punished is this wonderful organization that's really working on kind of dismantling logics of incarceration, as well as like immediate help for women who have been incarcerated for fighting back in domestic violence cases. And so these are the questions that I want us as planners to think about every time we have a cool idea that we think is going to be fun, which is, does it legitimize or expand a system we're trying to dismantle? And I'll use the example of affordable housing, right? Right now, planners try to get 5%, 10%, set aside from a market rate development to be affordable. And I really mean the scare quotes here, right? Oftentimes it is not targeted for low income, but it's just below market rate, right? It's not as expensive as it could be. But the way that developers fund that is through that hot property market, right? The real estate industry has to be booming for them to feel like they can, set aside 10 units that they're not going to make money on. So that just legitimizes the existing real estate kind of private property regime, right? Second question, does it preserve existing power relations? And I think this is where the process question really comes up, right? People have sort of said, oh, this is a great time to do bike lanes and other kinds of street improvements because there's not as much vehicle traffic. But if we're taking this opportunity without any kind of consideration of the process, right? Who's making this decision, then excuse me, right? Like what kind of it doesn't matter how good our intentions are, right? Intent is not magic. If we're still excluding people who've been excluded from the process, what's going to be the outcome? And I've sort of adapted these questions, and I would encourage you to go to survivedandpunished.org for the kind of full story. But I think the last one, I said, does it undermine efforts to organize and mobilize the most affected? And I think that's the thing that I want us to kind of dwell on, which is, who is most at risk, right? Who is the most vulnerable, and how do we start from there instead of, I think, what is like trickle down urbanism. I've seen arguments, oh, well, sidewalk cafes will mean that there's more restaurant jobs, and those people who work in restaurants are people of color. There was some silent screaming in my head when I read that. And I just, this is the last piece that I want to talk about, which is, what is colonial planning and what is decolonial planning? And I think colonial planning is, the imposition of colonial logics, right? That improvement means that you fence something off. Improvement means that you brought, cows and wheat, that you don't value what is already there, right? You don't value the relational knowledge that the Native peoples have. You sort of devalue what people have built in a sort of a collective historical sense. And that to decolonize planning really just means stripping kind of this project of improvement, or, let's make things better, to that very core question of like, how do we define what's better, right? What do we define as improvement? And I think, this is the piece that I really am trying to understand, which is, how do you do it from the inside, right? Can you decolonize a county planning department? As well as like, how can you do it from the outside? And I really, want us kind of collectively, the people who are here listening and watching, to think about, like, what is the underlying story and logic of what we're doing, and making sure, right, and going back to the abolitionist report card, right, making sure that it's really challenging the structures of oppression and domination, and instead of kind of decorating it with nice public parks. So I'll stop there. I think, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not leaving a meeting. So I'll stop there. I, hope, and I'll send these to Black Rose Books, the kind of bibliography that I suggested. There's really amazing thinking happening that I think we all can learn from. So thank you. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Annette.
If you hear questions, or you can pick up on some threads that Tom, you said, or Silky said.
Yeah, comments, questions. What did we miss?
So much. I've been repeating this over and over on all my Zoom calls this week, which is that the LA City budget, proposed budget, is 54% of unencumbered general funds is going to the LAPD. And so, a budget is a statement of our values and ethics. So as we shrink budgets because of COVID, I think really making sure that we pay attention to where that money is going, and don't sort of fall victim to kind of the safety, right? Like, we need to be safe, therefore we're going to spend 1.x billion on the LAPD. I really, thinking about what Silky was saying, is that this has already been happening, right? Like, this was happening in previous administrations. But if we're just doubling down and reinforcing a bad system, like, right, isn't this the time to say, like, wait, nothing is working, right? So we've got to take down not just pieces of it, but most of it.
Yeah.
free them all.
I think that's been one of the most interesting things about this moment when, that first 2 weeks of March when things came to a head, and, we were like, okay, like there's going to be all this stuff that people do in terms of getting people out of detention, but we need to make the case to free them all, to release them all, because ultimately this is calling to question, why do we put people, like when you look at the New York Times website and see all the clusters, it's like prisons and meat packing plants and jails, and like that's where you have like really major clusters of the disease spreading. And it's just like, well, why do we even put people there? Like, why are people in pretrial detention in the first place, or why are people in prison in general? But like, I also think that this is an opening for us. I mean, as devastating as this moment is, I think there is a lot of opening. And I think, I don't know a ton about what's happening with this, but Newsom's effort in California, because raising questions around the budget, like really reducing or ending the incarceration of youth, I think is a really big, exciting decision. And I think, in so many ways, actually, one of our big campaigns, it's called Defund Hate. In addition to the work we do to close down facilities or stop expansion, a lot of our work is around appropriations, because for so many years, we've had all these like Democrats say, we are supportive of immigrants, but then they vote for these really harsh appropriations bills that expand a ton of money for ICE and CBP and border militarization. And so I think budgets are hugely important in this conversation. And really this question of investment is one, I think that actually this space would be exciting for us to figure out, like, how can we challenge this idea, because we're constantly calling for divestment, but we want to know what that like vision could be.
But I think it's going to be a huge struggle. New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States, just announced a $9 billion budget deficit, and the mayor now claims that we are in a fiscal crisis. You know what happened in the last fiscal crisis? They cut the civilian workforce. They reduced union negotiated benefits. And they stopped investing in communities of color, and wouldn't send fire trucks to the Bronx while it was burning, to Brooklyn neighborhoods. So we're facing the other possibility that the crisis will be used in order to abandon the same neighborhoods that have been devastated by the COVID crisis, which are the communities of color. Black and brown neighborhoods and Asian neighborhoods have been the ones where the highest number of hospitalizations and deaths have occurred, and where we already had severe public health crises to begin with. And the disinvestment for the last 3 decades in the healthcare system. We once had a viable public hospital system in New York City. But it's been cut back, and now it's the condition. Now you can just imagine when the next mayoral race starts and the city council race, people are going to be saying, "Well, we're in a fiscal crisis. What can we do? We won't have the money." Oh, you guys have a lot of good ideas, and we better keep those jails, because we know that. When people are out of work and there's poverty, crime increases. So we better put the money into beefing up the police and keeping the jails. They're already talking about building new jails.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely, I think that, and then our concern about, like, because so many places are going to be cash strapped, they're going to say, well, we got to keep these jails open. Jails are going to bring more money in for us. And that's also, yeah. So there's a lot of risks. I think I'm, to do the work I do, often I have to think about it optimistically. And so my hope is we can take on those openings as much as possible. But I see there's some questions on the side here, so I don't know if
And I think maybe Edwin, third time's the charm. We can try to.
Hello.
Oh, hi, Edwin.
Oh,
Okay.
hi. I'm here.
Hey.
Still.
Sounds better.
Sounds so much better. Thanks.
Okay, can I answer the questions now?
Go ahead.
Hi. I'm here. I have never left the place. Hello. Hello.
We can hear you.
We can hear you,
We
Edwin.
can hear you, so you can make your presentation.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, your question was about the resistance, the role the resistance play in planning. Well, resistance planning makes the planning process an educational and political process that helps people gain more control over their environment and their lives. And I emphasize the educational process. It's not just a matter of solving problems, but learning from them, so that the citizens, communities can be in charge of their own projects. Resistance planning sees the role of the professionals not only as reactive, but as proactive. She is an educator. Again, planning design is an educational process. That he or she doesn't necessarily wait to be called, but when he or she sees possible outcomes and threats, sends warning signals and shows the need to intervene publicly, inviting people to become involved. It supports projects that respond to alternative ways of using land and national resources, projects that question the way we conceptualize education, health, food, and the way we deal with work and power. Or how does it support alternative projects? How? Well, by working on the design of new spaces that facilitates the workings of the new projects. New projects need new spaces. New proposals need new representations, new metaphors, new images, new ways of imagining, new sources of imagination. Resistance planning is sometimes even irrational because it's more concerned with people and feelings than numbers. Examples from Puerto Rico, well, I can give you at least one. When communities, disadvantaged communities, are threatened for elimination, when they can prepare their own counter proposals, then design becomes a tool for negotiation. It is a different power situation. When you go and just said, I don't want that, but when you go and say, we don't want that, but this is our proposal, then design becomes a tool for negotiation, a tool for empowerment. Okay? How can architects and planners be involved in planning and in the creation of new, more just cities? Again, designs are tools for involvement and negotiation. Architects can be very active in the co-design of counter-proposals that represent the community's perspective. Again, having a plan or a design is having a tool for negotiation and empowerment. Transformative planning and resistance planning exposes and respects other ways of appropriating space and reinforces the capacity of the designs to support divergent lifestyles. It's to consider space as an important component in the creation of new, more just cities. Again, new projects need new spaces. Different forms of appropriation of public spaces have an effect in space also, and architects and planners can support and facilitate these efforts. Okay. Well, I think that summarizes what I wanted to say. And hello.
Thanks so much, Edwin.
Thank you, Edwin.
Okay.
And we got the chirp too from the coquille.
Okay.
But there are a bunch of questions, and it looks like they're for Annette.
Or I think just the first one was talking about, or asking if I could talk more about the connections between abolition and decolonial planning, and maybe think about connections to labor movement. And I had said with a caveat that I'm still really learning about both. By no means am I an expert, but I think both are imaginative and creative, right? Like, it's really hard to imagine a world without prisons, to be totally honest, right? It's really hard to imagine a world where we don't think of land as a thing to profit from, or, you know, the right to exclude other people. It's not easy, I think, to kind of come up with those, to, you know, imagine in 5, 10, 15 years, like what kind of society that would be. So I think they're both really imaginative and creative as much as they are, you know, dismantling a structure, right? And then I think in terms of the role of the labor movement, I was excited. So in Hawaii, you know, Unite here, Local 5, the union that represents hotel workers, is really sort of talking about our members are not just workers, right? Our members live in these communities. So what does it mean when, you know, a particular policy or development would immediately benefit us in the way of more jobs, but has a larger and long-term negative effect? And so, you know, say no, right? Like, we're not just the person who gets a paycheck. We're also the person who lives here, you know, builds community here. So that's kind of where I'm thinking that the labor movement has done some really cool things, but also in Hawaii especially, has been part of the growth machine, because it's been defined as, well, we need jobs, right? Like, whatever jobs they might be, you know, that's what we need.
Okay.
Oh, I'll just say really quickly on the actions. I think especially around COVID right now, there's a lot of efforts to free people from prisons and detention centers and jails. And so, you know, I think there's some stuff on our website at Detention Watch Network. There's Free Them All for Public Health in New York. There's so many efforts across the country. And if you try to plug into those and get both your local county officials or city officials or your governor to get folks released from those facilities, I think that's a really important push right now. And also on the budget piece, that's really, you know, again, those are like members of Congress. And so getting your representative, your senator to really push for reducing the amount of funds that are going to ICE and CBP. Just put that out there as an action folks can take. There's a lot of stuff on our website at detentionwatchnetwork.org.
I would like to respond to the question about, questions about specific things that we can do now, or that planners, activists, individuals can do now. And COVID-19 presents some possible opportunities. It's a pandemic. It's an unusual situation. And living in New York, I get very frustrated when I see the elected officials and the planners in office missing the opportunities, waiting for disaster capitalism to come in and give them the answers. We have an enormous problem of air pollution and traffic caused by the monopoly of the automobile. So what does the mayor do? He says, I'm going to close a few streets. No, it's not good enough. This is the time to rethink the public transportation system. I have to tell you, living in New York now, the air is so much cleaner. I can notice it. every morning when I go out, breathe the air. This is telling us something. The airline travel has been reduced. Airline travel is one of the most inefficient uses of fossil fuels. Yet we have a governor that's talking about building another airport or expanding the existing airports. And so these are enormous opportunities, but the political dialogue is so much controlled by a mentality of diminished expectations. Oh, well, we can't have a city without cars. How would people get around? Well, we have the biggest mass transit system in North America. We could start with that, and we can make a better bus system and solve the transportation problem and improve the health and daily life of the people who suffer most, who are poor people and poor people of color, who are the ones who have high rates of asthma and respiratory diseases because of the air pollution. So I'm frustrated, but there are enormous opportunities. And I think it's up to activists to raise their voices now and demand the impossible, because all of these things are considered impossible. A city without cars. Oh, where could that be? It's not going to happen here. And so, but that's what we mean by the power of resistance and real, genuine, participatory planning that empowers people. There's so many
just
opportunities.
to jump in, thinking about the things that we can do, I am struggling. I mean, I live with a person and 2 cats, so I'm not alone. But it's lonely in stay-at-home orders, and that I think if we forget that we build power collectively, then it can feel even lonelier, right? Like, oh, you're just the lone voice in the wilderness tweeting at politicians or whatever it might be. So I think one thing is like find your people, right? Find an organization that's already doing work that you would love to plug into and figure out how to be useful. I know it's kind of easy to find an organization and not as easy necessarily to figure out how you can plug in. So maybe it's really just doing the grunt work, right? Like maybe, whatever it might be. I was going to say like, clean up after events, but that's not what's happening right now. And then I guess, there was a question around, or I guess to follow up on the what can you do immediately is also to learn. I mean, one thing that has been, it's like been an embarrassment of riches in terms of access to different conversations. And, I'm really doing my best to learn as much as I can about disability justice as something that I haven't really been thinking about, and that's a problem. And so I think that's one thing, and one way that you could possibly find your people, right, is to really commit to learning something that you don't know. And then sort of coming at that with a spirit of humility, right, and an inquiry, and knowing that we're all learning together.
There was a question about sort of like alternatives to prisons and what that would look like in a post-COVID-19 world. I mean, I do think that at the very least for pretrial detention and for I mean, this is a little pie in the sky, but I also think there is something about people not being able to move in the experience of staying at home and how much we can like tap into people's like beliefs about what that means to be confined in space. Obviously, none of us are experiencing that who are just staying at home, but I think there is something to be said about that. And then in terms of the alternatives, like I think in so many ways, the alternatives have been these really harsh surveillance models that include ankle shackles on people's bodies, and both in what it's done has been like expand the scope of custody of people who are in, some form of custody, even if it's not a physical facility, both in the context of the criminal legal system and also in ICE detention and elsewhere. So I think we do need to talk about a vision of a world where, one, I think it's, a lot of people are like, okay, if you don't have prisons, what do you have? But I actually think this whole conversation is about, what do you have? Like, you have a world where people feel safe, where they feel they can thrive, where they feel they get the services that they need. They can be with their family, community, and have the healthcare, like all the things. Like, you don't have a system where people are doing harm as much. But in truth, we know that instances of harm are going to happen. And so we do need to think about restorative justice, transformative justice models that can support those folks who need support. But at the same time, I think when we talk about abolition, it always has to be about, what's the world we want to create that creates the conditions where people aren't, pushed to do harm. And so I would just say that that's, I think coming out of COVID-19 and thinking, or the post-COVID, whatever this thing is going to be, like, it's an opportunity for us to envision better. Like, we're talking about essential workers, a lot of who are immigrants, who are not getting the services they need, who aren't getting their, the stimulant, whatever, like all the resources. We're talking about the healthcare system and how much that has played a role in the number of deaths we've seen in the US, especially. And so I think so much of that is a moment to say, okay, what's the world we can create? And that, I think, in turn impacts what we're seeing in prisons and jails and et cetera, or it should.
I saw a question about how to combat austerity budgets earlier on. And, I think part of that is getting ahead of the story, right? Like, I think budgets are starting to be revised now, right? The state of California just recommended a 10% across the board cut to the Cal State system, right? We can't afford to give you guys the budget, we promised you. And so then really thinking about, both from an economic argument, which I hate that so many of our, why we should do housing first and not criminalize homeless people is like, oh, because it's cheaper. That's a very irritating place to start. That's not what the values that we wanted to focus on. But nonetheless, you can talk a little bit about the monetary arguments about, keeping jobs, right? But also, I think, and I'm this is where I'm like puzzling my, like, do local newspapers, like, they still print copies? How does this work? Because how do we make sure this conversation is happening in the places that policymakers pay attention to, right? Like, I made my students read newspapers as part of a neighborhood development class, and they're like, I've never touched such a thing before. But this is still a space where policymakers pay attention, right? So can we capture and take over media spaces to really amplify these alternatives, right? And I think there's amazing journalists, but they're not policy experts, right? Like, they're not, activists on the ground. So they don't have as much ability to really give the big context. So if we have that big context, then making sure that it doesn't just stay here, right? That it gets out everywhere. And I still don't know quite how to do that, but it's something that we need to get ahead of the austerity story, right? And we need to sort of challenge it from the get-go. And, I think here, Black Lives Matter LA is doing a people's budget, right? So putting forth an actual alternative to spending $1 billion on the LAPD, right? Like, what can we do with that $1 billion, instead of $300 million on bullets, right? What can we do with $300 million? So that's sort of my suggestion. And, if people have better ideas, I'd love to hear it.
Well, and one of the things that's popping up again in New York is, believe it or not, a grassroots demand for real planning, community planning, and planning by the city. And it's surprising in a city that's dominated by real estate. But people are coming up and saying, this is the time to do it differently. And some elected officials are attuned to this, very few. And yes, it's about organizing, political organizing. Elections are coming up, and it means getting candidates who will sign on to the platforms we send them. Will you support community land trusts? Will you support community? Will you agree to close all the jails? And things like that. And it builds on the civic infrastructure that's already there. But it takes organizing, and planners got to do it too, because the city planning department is missing in action.
There's this great story. Okay, San Antonio Communities Organized for Public Service. It has an unfortunate actual acronym. So I think they are now COPS, Metro Leaders, but they have been around since the 70s, and they basically went, door to door knocking. I don't know if they went door to door, but the main organizer, met with 1,000 people before they even launched any, kind of campaign. So there's a little bit of that, like, we do have to do the grunt work, and I am not entirely sure how we quite do that. Like, social media makes it both seem easier and harder. Anyway, but they are still in existence, and they still get candidates to come down to their spot, right? Like, they're not going to City Hall. The candidates come down, and they list off, right, will you support no new jails? Like, will you support, an increased budget for public housing? And the candidates get to say yes or no, and that's it, right? Like, you either pledge or you don't pledge. And then there is an organization that holds you accountable after you've been elected. Are you going to do this? And I love that in learning about this organization, because I sort of hate relying on just the electoral system, right? Even though obviously we need to change policy, and that means we need to change policymakers. But I love that this is an organization that does both. It builds power within the community, right, to do things, and then it leverages that power on city council in San Antonio. So that's the piece that I think is really important, is that it's not just the election, right? It's like then keeping track of what city council is up to. How much are they spending on XYZ, right? Like, who are they listening to? I think the city and county of Honolulu, I think I've heard from every single council member that I talked to that we need housing at every price point, because they've been talking to developers. Right? That's the only thing they know. They believe that to solve affordable housing crisis in Honolulu is that you need to just build more, because magically, right, there is no such thing as commodification of housing. And so just magically, if there's an empty home, that magically will become less, expensive. Anyway, so there's something around, I think, that piece of, both narrative, right? Like, who are the policymakers talking to, but also how do we build power within communities and then exert that outside.
Yeah,
But,
I mean, on jails also, there's just like such a weird role that sheriffs play. I think some people don't realize, like, there's so, like, also just like, what's the point of sheriffs? But you just have all this like intense role that this like thing that's like somebody who's put in power through an electoral process, and it's kind of a joke, but like, I think that's something that needs to be addressed too. So it's like, in so many ways, I think the more people can get involved locally, you can see those real impacts. I think what Annette and Tom are both saying, and I know right now it feels really hard because like people can't be in person and can't do, but I think there's still just so much that people are doing to have influence and have impact. And the more you can get into local organizations, do whatever you can. I think that's where to go right now.
Well, I hope I haven't been too pessimistic. So I'm going to say something optimistic. I mean, New York City has a rich tradition of civic engagement, grassroots organizing. And we fought for the last decade or more against massive rezonings of our communities, our neighborhoods, that were pushed by the idea that you have to build new housing in order to solve the housing problem. And of course, the areas that were rezoned were where people of color were living, low-income people, working people, and they were forced out because the rezoning jacked up the value of land. And over the last decade, though, people began to fight back. And the current mayor had proposed 15 rezonings. It was only able to pass 5 of them. And why? Because of the fight back. And that's something to build on. And you know, you can't just have a political drive without being driven by struggle. And that's what this demonstrates to me. That power succeeds nothing without a fight. And you do the fight, then you're in a better position. Our communities, our neighborhoods, our organizers are in a better position to go to the elected officials, to pick the elected officials and tell them what to do, because they're waiting to hear from you.
Oh, I see we got the 5-minute wrap up final remarks. Oh, and there's another question. Hi, Sarah. You know, that there's an openness. And I think Silky pointed to this too, is like people now have, I think, more understanding and empathy, right? Like, I mean, my partner was saying, you're so naive, that people are thinking about Amazon warehouse workers more than ever, right? Not everybody, but there's like a kind of visibility to what was invisible before, like essential workers in many different industries, delivery, et cetera. And, you know, thinking about if people are thinking about confinement in new ways, right? Because we have these experiences that are, you know, not by any means close to similar, but nonetheless, sort of opening up our empathy. And yeah, like the people, I think, are receptive, right? So then how do we channel the sort of feeling of like, oh yeah, the world is messed up. Like, this is not fair, right? And then push it into action. And I don't know, like, I think that's the big question for me right now, is that I think there are a lot of people who are ready, poised to do something, and poised to do something more than an online petition. And so how do we build those spaces? And maybe it's going to existing organizations and saying, hey, I would love to be a volunteer that helps you create, you know, a bunch of small like support groups, right, that are like trying to understand what you guys are doing and figure out ways to support your work and amplify your work, instead of, yeah, like find the existing groups to support and not just imagine the separate new thing that's shiny.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a funny moment. I mean, just a final comment to say, I think, like, even with what happened with George Floyd and how devastating it was, to see how much people are just feeling the need to do something, you're seeing that, and you see that, like, like, we haven't lost our ability to, like, I think they're and like people have this ability to engage with people. Like, we're having this conversation, I don't know if it would have happened but in this way that opens a lot of space for learning and growth, like you were saying before, Annette, just in terms of like, this is a moment to take in and sort of think about where we go. And so I do think that, like, it's very frustrating, and sometimes it can feel naive to be like, oh, people are thinking about immigrant workers or this and that, but but I do think we have to, we can't, I don't want to say it's an opportunity. It's such a devastating moment, but there is an opening and we need to take advantage of it. And we need to do everything we can to bring more people in to understand the role that they play and that we can play to have an impact. So yeah, but thank you so much for having me on. I know we're out of time. So Tom.
Is Edwin still with us and want to add a final word?
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello. Can I
Go ahead.
Can I speak now? Okay. Well, I have another hopeful comment. Is that my hope in in Puerto Rico is that many small groups are growing up, that are questioning very deeply ingrained concepts of health, of housing, of construction, of agriculture, of communality. So, and by doing that, they are questioning the way the system is working in Puerto Rico. So I think that by supporting them as architects and planners, we can really give them support in terms of thinking out with them new concepts of new spaces, of new architecture that makes those projects work well, look well, and communicate to others symbolically what they are about. So I'm very, very hopeful that these small groups will change at least some very important aspects of our country, which is in a very deep crisis, economically, socially. So I'm hopeful. I think that we can make some changes if we work together, supporting, at least from my perspective as architects and planners, supporting those ways of those proposals about how we live and how we think about ourselves, our communities, and our resources. So thank you very much for the invitation. I finally made it, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Edwin. And my final word is one of hope that listen to the climate justice movement. There are enormous opportunities at this moment to push a new and different vision of the city, our city, the city that is fair and just, and the Green New Deal, a just New Deal, and just recovery come out of the environmental climate justice movements, and I think we need to look there and build alliances to make better cities and rural areas too, by the way.
Well, I think I'll jump in here. And I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today. That was a really excellent talk. I'm really glad we got to hear from Edwin in the end and that we resolved those tech issues by the end. We're still going to try to go ahead and have an extended conversation with him as soon as we can. But in the meantime, we've already set up his chapter that's included in Transformative Planning. It's in the comments, a link to it. We're freely providing his chapter in the book. So if you want to hear more from him right away, you can go ahead and read his chapter, which is in Transformative Planning. The link is right there in the comments. So we hope you'll go ahead and read that and stay tuned because we're going to try to do something with him. And this book is discounted right now, both on our website. The physical book is discounted by 30%, and it's only $5 for the ebook on our PayHip. So I hope you'll go ahead and get yourself a copy. I talked about other relevant books. So if you missed that at the beginning, you can go ahead and rewind to the beginning to hear about other books that are relevant to this conversation and this talk. There's also a link in the comments to our newsletter, so you can go ahead and subscribe and stay up to date with what's happening next. Our next event is going to be around Eve Engler's book, House of Mirrors, which is one of the only critical accounts of Trudeau's foreign policy, which as we come out of this crisis, I think we're all going to see that it's very important we consider his track record on foreign policy. And we hope on June 4th that our live stream event will go ahead and not only engage this conversation around the UN Security Council and Canada's potential role in it, but we'll also go ahead and be able to delve into some aspects of this book. This is also discounted on our PayHip site. It's only $5 for the ebook. So thank you again to all of our speakers for joining us. Thank you to our partners.
Jason,
And Tom, go ahead. Yes.
just a quick thing I forgot, an advertisement.
Please.
If you want more information on Planners Network, plannersnetwork.org is the website, plus progressivecity.net is the current publication, free and open to everybody. Visit those sites. Thank
Great. You. Do that. I can attest. They're both excellent. And the last thing is I want to thank everyone who tuned in, especially those of you who stuck through our little technical blip there. You never know what's going to happen. No matter how much you prepare, it can happen. So really appreciate you sticking through, and hope you'll still share this video around with anybody who you think will get something from it. And with that, we're going to go ahead and end this stream, and we will see you all again on June 4th. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for
so long.
inviting us.
Thank you. Thank you. And